The house stood on the edge of Briarwood Forest, a solitary figure against the dark silhouette of the trees. Its windows, fogged with years of neglect, seemed to weep condensation, while the sagging porch creaked in protest against the wind's insistence. No one in town dared to approach it, not since the whispers began. Clara Henderson didn't believe in ghosts. She'd spent her life brushing aside her grandmother's superstitions, but as an investigator for the Paranormal Research Society, she often found herself drawn to stories that defied explanation. When the anonymous letter arrived in her inbox, describing faint murmurs heard in the dead of night at the Briarwood house, she dismissed it at first. But something about the sender's plea, "It's not the whispers, it's what follows them," lingered like the chill of a winter draft. "Another dead-end case?" Clara muttered as she stepped out of her car, flashlight in hand. She was met by the bitter scent of decay from the overgrown yard. A rusted gate hung crookedly, its latch broken, as if warning her away. "This one's different," her partner, Lucas, had said. "I feel it." His words replayed in her mind as she crossed the threshold, the heavy oak door groaning under her touch. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and the faint tang of old wood. The foyer's once grand staircase was now a skeletal ruin, its balustrades stripped by time. Clara's flashlight traced patterns on the peeling wallpaper, faded roses, their petals curling as if in retreat from something unseen. A sudden whisper brushed her ear, soft and unintelligible, like the pages of a book being turned. "Lucas," she called, her voice steady despite the icy shiver that prickled her spine. There was no reply, only the sound of her own breathing amplified in the oppressive silence. She turned to see him still outside, unloading their equipment. The whisper came again, this time clearer. A woman's voice, lilting and fractured. "Help me." Her instinct was to write it off as wind slipping through cracks in the decrepit walls. Yet, as she moved deeper into the house, the whispers grew more frequent. They seemed to originate from every corner, overlapping and chaotic, a symphony of the lost. Clara felt her skepticism waver, replaced by a gnawing unease. She set up her recorder in the parlor, where the air was heaviest. The room was littered with relics of the past, a tarnished chandelier, a shattered mirror, and a child's porcelain doll slumped in a corner, its glass eyes staring blankly. "If there's anyone here, make your presence known," Clara said, her voice firm but inviting. The room answered with silence. Then, faintly, a child's giggle echoed from upstairs. Lucas entered, his expression grim. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he joked, though his tone lacked humor. Clara pointed toward the staircase. "I heard something, up there." Together, they ascended, each creak of the wooden steps a reminder of how easily the house could collapse beneath them. At the top, they found a nursery frozen in time. Dust-coated toys lay scattered, and a crib sat eerily pristine in the corner, as if someone had tended to it recently. Clara's flashlight landed on a message scrawled on the wall in faded red. "They come when you listen." The whispers erupted again, louder this time and unmistakably close. "Leave," they hissed, their tone venomous. Clara and Lucas exchanged a look, their skepticism dissolving under the weight of what they just experienced. Clara's heart thundered as she realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it didn't want them there. The whispers chased them out of the nursery, their dissonant voices trailing like icy fingers. Clara stumbled into the hallway, her flashlight flickering as if the batteries were drained by some unseen force. Lucas was right behind her, his breathing shallow, his face pale. The door to the nursery slammed shut behind them, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. "What the hell was that?" Lucas demanded, his voice quivering despite his attempt at bravado. Clara didn't answer. Her mind was racing, replaying the overlapping voices, the message scrawled on the wall, the giggle that didn't belong. She had walked into haunted places before, but this was different. The air felt charged, as if the house were pulsating with an energy all its own. They made their way back to the parlor, where their equipment stood untouched. Clara grabbed the voice recorder and hit play. The static crackled before the whispers emerged. Faint but unmistakable. "Leave now, or stay forever," the voices warned, layered and chilling. Clara's hands trembled as she set the recorder down. "This isn't residual energy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These entities are intelligent." Lucas swore under his breath. Great. Intelligent ghosts. Just what we need. He began packing their gear, his movements hurried. We're not equipped for this, Clara. Let's get out of here and come back with reinforcements. But Clara couldn't leave. Not yet. Something about the house felt personal, as if it were calling to her. We need answers, she said firmly. Who are they? Why are they here? And what did they mean by stay forever? Lucas stopped, his expression hardening. Clara, this isn't about curiosity. This place is dangerous. We need to. He froze mid-sentence, his eyes widening. Clara followed his gaze to the shattered mirror in the corner. A figure was reflected there. A woman in a tattered dress, her face obscured by a veil. She stood motionless, yet the whispers swirled around her, growing louder, more frantic. Clara spun around, but the figure was gone. Did you see that? Lucas asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The whispers faded, replaced by a heavy silence that was somehow worse. It pressed against them, suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. They decided to explore the basement next, drawn by a faint glow seeping through the cracks in the floorboards. The descent was treacherous, the wooden steps slick with mold. The air grew colder with each step, carrying the metallic tang of damp earth. When they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a small, stone-walled room illuminated by a single, flickering lantern. On the floor was a circle of blackened candles surrounding an old journal. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, its edges singed as if it had survived a fire. Clara hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing against the embossed initials, MH. Who's MH? Lucas asked, his voice echoing in the confined space. Clara opened the journal, revealing pages filled with frantic, looping handwriting. The entries described the whispers, the way they grew louder each night, how they seemed to speak directly to the writer's deepest fears. The final entry read, "They are not spirits. They are shadows that cling to the soul. Once you hear them, they never let go." The lantern flickered violently before going out, plunging the room into darkness. Clara felt a hand grip her arm, but when she turned, Lucas was on the other side of the room. "Clara?" His voice came trembling. "What's wrong?" A whisper slithered through the darkness, clearer than before. "You shouldn't have come." Clara's breath caught as the journal was ripped from her hands by an invisible force, its pages flying open before slamming shut. The sound was deafening in the silence. Then came the laughter, childlike, yet hollow, echoing from the walls. They scrambled back up the stairs, the whispers following them like a tidal wave. The house seemed to shift around them, doors slamming, walls groaning as if alive. By the time they reached the parlor, their equipment was gone, replaced by a single piece of paper on the table. Written in the same looping handwriting as the journal were the words, "It's too late." The paper on the table seemed to vibrate with an unseen energy. Clara stared at the looping handwriting, her pulse thundering in her ears. Lucas stood frozen beside her, his face pale and slick with sweat. The words, "It's too late," felt more like a sentence than a warning. "Clara, we're leaving," Lucas said, his voice firm but strained. He grabbed her wrist, tugging her toward the door. But as they moved, the whispers surged again, filling the house with a symphony of despair and anger. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, the very structure of the house seeming to resist their escape. The front door slammed shut just as they reached it, the sound reverberating through the walls. Lucas yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Come on," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This isn't happening." Clara turned back toward the parlor, her mind racing. There had to be a way out. But as she scanned the room, her eyes landed on the shattered mirror in the corner. For a moment, her reflection stared back at her, until it didn't. The figure in the mirror shifted, transforming into the veiled woman they had seen upstairs. Her hand reached out, pressing against the glass as though it were a window. "Help me," she whispered, her voice resonating through the room. Clara felt a pull deep in her chest, a strange compulsion to step closer. Lucas grabbed her arm. "Don't," he warned, his tone laced with panic. "This house is playing tricks on you." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the woman wasn't part of the house's malice. Her whispers were softer, pleading, in stark contrast to the other's venomous tones. Against her better judgment, Clara approached the mirror, her reflection fading entirely as the veiled woman's image grew sharper. "Who are you?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. The woman's lips moved, forming words Clara couldn't hear. The whispers drowned her out, growing louder, more chaotic. Clara pressed her hands against her ears, her heart pounding as the veiled woman mouthed the words again. Basement. Lantern. Clara turned to Lucas, who was frantically trying to force the door open. "We have to go back to the basement," she said. He whipped around, his eyes wide. "Are you out of your mind? That's where all this started." "She's trying to tell us something," Clara insisted. "I think she's trapped here, like the others. Maybe she knows how to stop this." Lucas stared at her, his jaw clenched. Finally, he nodded, though his fear was palpable. Together, they retraced their steps, descending once again into the house's bowels. The lantern was still there, its faint glow barely illuminating the circle of blackened candles. As Clara knelt to examine the lantern, the whispers converged into a single voice, deep, guttural, and unmistakably male. "You were warned," it growled. The room seemed to tilt, the air growing thick and oppressive. Clara lit the lantern, its flickering light casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then a low rumble began, the stone walls trembling as cracks spread like veins across their surface. From the shadows, shapes emerged, humanoid but wrong. Their bodies were fractured, their movements jerky, like marionettes controlled by unseen strings. They surrounded Clara and Lucas, their empty eyes glowing faintly in the lantern's light. "Don't look at them," Clara whispered, her voice tight with fear. She focused on the journal still lying in the circle, its pages fluttering as though caught in an invisible wind. The veiled woman's image flashed in Clara's mind. Basement. Lantern. "Lucas, hold the light," she shouted, shoving the lantern into his hands. She grabbed the journal, flipping through the pages until she found a crude drawing of the house. At its center was a sigil, a jagged, star-like symbol with an inscription beneath it. "The seal binds them. Break it and they will be free." The shadows closed in, their whispers returning in a frenzy. Clara's hands shook as she tore the page from the journal, holding it up to the lantern's light. "This is it," she said, her voice breaking. "We have to destroy the seal." "But how?" Lucas asked, his eyes darting between the encroaching figures and the page in Clara's hands. Clara's gaze fell on the blackened candles. "Fire," she said. "We need fire." Lucas hesitated for only a moment before setting the lantern down in the center of the circle. He smashed its glass casing with a rock, igniting the spilled fuel. The flames leapt to life, consuming the page and the candles in a rush of heat and light. The shadows screamed, their voices melding into a single, anguished cry. One by one, they dissolved into the walls, their forms unraveling like smoke. The house groaned, its structure shuddering violently as if resisting their departure. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. Clara and Lucas stood in silence, the basement eerily still. The whispers were gone. The silence in the basement was suffocating. The once flickering flames of the lantern had been reduced to faint embers, and the air hung heavy, as if the house was holding its breath. Clara clutched the charred remains of the journal's page, her mind racing with questions. The whispers were gone, but the house still felt wrong, alive in its stillness. "Is it over?" Lucas asked, his voice hoarse. He leaned against the wall, his face pale, sweat glistening on his brow. Clara didn't answer. She glanced at the circle of burnt candles, then back at the veiled woman's figure in her mind. The seal was broken, the shadows banished, but something lingered, something unfinished. "I don't think so," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the far corner of the basement. The shadows there seemed darker, thicker, as if hiding something. The veiled woman's voice echoed faintly in her mind. "Help me!" Without waiting for Lucas, Clara approached the corner. Her flashlight barely penetrated the dense darkness, and each step felt heavier, as though the house was trying to pull her back. Her foot struck something solid, a wooden chest, its surface etched with the same jagged sigil from the journal. "Lucas, over here," she called, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. Lucas joined her, his reluctance evident in every step. "This better not be another trap," he muttered, though his curiosity outweighed his fear. Together, they pried open the chest, revealing its contents. A tattered veil, a bundle of letters tied with a crimson ribbon, and a small, ornate dagger. Clara picked up the letters, the parchment brittle under her touch. The first one was addressed to Margaret Holloway, the initials from the journal. She read aloud, her voice trembling. Dearest Margaret, the voices have grown stronger. They call to me in the night, whispering secrets I dare not repeat. The ritual was meant to protect us, but I fear it has only chained us to this cursed place. If you are reading this, it means I have failed. Forgive me. You must finish what I could not. Break the chain and free our souls. Margaret Holloway, Clara whispered, the name tasting foreign yet familiar. She looked at the veil, now realizing it belonged to the woman in the mirror. She's the key. Lucas frowned. Break the chain? What does that even mean? And what's with the dagger? Clara's fingers traced the intricate designs on the blade, a coiled serpent, its fangs bared. The sigil from the journal was engraved on the hilt. I think the dagger was meant for the ritual, she said, to sever whatever binds them here. But who's them? Lucas pressed, his voice rising. We don't even know what we're dealing with. The whispers returned, faint and mournful, weaving through the air like a lament. They weren't angry this time. They sounded almost desperate. Clara's grip tightened on the dagger. We have to finish this, she said, her resolve hardening. She placed the veil over the circle of burnt candles, the fabric shimmering faintly as if infused with an otherworldly energy. The whispers swelled, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Clara raised the dagger, her heart pounding. Margaret, she called out, her voice firm. If you're here, show me what to do. The room grew colder, frost creeping along the stone walls. The veiled woman appeared in the corner, her form more solid than before. Her hands trembled as she pointed to the dagger, then to herself. Clara's stomach twisted as understanding dawned. She wants us to. No, Lucas interrupted, his voice sharp. We're not doing that. There has to be another way. There isn't, Clara said, her throat tightening. She's trapped here, Lucas. They all are. This is the only way to free them. Lucas stared at her, his expression torn between fear and trust. Finally, he nodded, his jaw clenched. Do it. Clara stepped into the circle, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. The veiled woman moved closer, her form shimmering as if caught between worlds. Clara raised the dagger, the whispers crescendoing around her. With a deep breath, she plunged the blade into the center of the veil. The room exploded with light, blinding and searing. Clara felt a wave of energy surge through her, knocking her to the ground. The whispers turned into a single, unified voice, a cry of release, of freedom. When the light faded, the veiled woman was gone. Clara and Lucas sat in stunned silence. The oppressive weight of the house finally lifted. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if the house itself had exhaled. They climbed the stairs, the creaks and groans gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The front door was open. As they stepped outside, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting the house in a soft, golden light. Clara looked back, her chest heavy with a mix of relief and sadness. She's free, she said, more to herself than to Lucas. Lucas placed a hand on her shoulder. So are we. The house remained silent as they walked away, its secrets buried once more. But as they reached their car, Clara swore she heard one last whisper, soft, grateful, and unmistakably Margaret's. Thank you. The moon hung low over the desolate countryside, its pale light tracing the silhouette of a dilapidated farmhouse at the edge of a dense, unyielding forest. For years, the house had been little more than a local curiosity, a place where children dared one another to venture and where hunters told exaggerated tales of eerie happenings. It wasn't until Evelyn Mercer arrived that the whispers began to spread like wildfire. Evelyn had inherited the house from a distant relative, someone she had never met and barely remembered hearing about. The letter from the attorney had arrived on her birthday, almost like a cruel joke, as if the universe had decided to gift her with something both unsettling and burdensome. She'd been adrift since her mother's passing 6 months earlier, so the idea of moving somewhere new, even to a place as uninviting as this, was oddly appealing. When Evelyn first stepped through the creaking front door, the air inside was heavy, as if steeped in years of secrets. Dust motes danced in the beams of her flashlight, illuminating faded wallpaper adorned with intricate twisting vines. She couldn't tell if the patterns were beautiful or disturbing, but she decided to settle in and reserve judgment. After all, the house was hers now. for better or worse. As the days passed, Evelyn began to notice oddities, shadows shifting in her peripheral vision, the faint smell of lavender that would appear and vanish without explanation, and a persistent chill that clung to certain rooms no matter how many space heaters she employed. She dismissed these things as the quirks of an old house until the whispers began. The first time Evelyn heard them, she was unpacking a box of books in the living room. At first, it sounded like the wind slipping through the cracks in the window panes, but then the sound took on a cadence, rising and falling as if voices were speaking just out of reach. She froze, her fingers gripping the spine of an old novel. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped immediately, as if they had been caught in the act. She laughed nervously and shook her head. "Get a grip, Ev," she muttered, though her hands trembled as she returned to unpacking. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder and more distinct, weaving words she couldn't quite understand. The following day, Evelyn ventured into the forest that bordered the property, hoping to clear her mind. The woods were dense, the trees gnarled and ancient, their roots clutching the earth like fingers. She stumbled upon a clearing where a crumbling stone well stood, its edges covered in moss. As she leaned closer, she thought she heard the faintest echo, a voice, almost childlike, calling her name. Startled, she backed away and returned to the house, her heart pounding. By the end of the week, Evelyn was no longer certain whether she was imagining things or if the house truly had a life of its own. The whispers grew bolder, filling the nights with chilling, incomprehensible murmurs. And yet, somewhere deep within her, a curiosity began to bloom, a desire to understand the voices and the secrets they carried. Evelyn awoke to the sound of someone humming. The melody was faint, but unmistakable, a tune she vaguely recognized from her childhood. She sat up, her heart hammering, and strained to listen. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that felt too heavy, too deliberate. Grabbing her phone for light, she crept down the hallway, her bare feet brushing against the warped wooden floorboards. The humming returned, guiding her to the parlor at the far end of the house. As she stepped into the room, her phone's glow illuminated a rocking chair swaying gently back and forth. It stopped abruptly when her light touched it, as though caught in an act it wasn't meant to perform. Evelyn's breath hitched, and she turned to leave. But a voice, clearer now than ever before, whispered her name. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. There was no reply, only the sound of the wind rattling the windows. She fled back to her room, locking the door behind her. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind churning with questions. What was happening in this house, and why did the whispers seem to know her name? The next day, Evelyn decided she needed answers. She began by sifting through the belongings left behind by the previous occupants. Most of the furniture and trinkets were unremarkable. Tarnished silverware, faded photographs, and stacks of yellowed letters. But one discovery stopped her in her tracks. A journal tucked away in a secret compartment beneath the bedroom floorboards. The journal belonged to a woman named Lila Mercer, who had lived in the house decades earlier. Its pages were filled with entries describing strange occurrences, the same whispers and shadows Evelyn had been experiencing. One entry, dated October 31st, 1953, caught her eye. "They speak to me every night, their voices rising from the walls and the forest. They tell me things I do not wish to hear, but I cannot turn away. I fear they are tied to the well. Something was thrown down there long ago, something that should never have been disturbed." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she traced the faded ink. The well in the woods flashed in her mind, its moss-covered edges now imbued with sinister significance. Determined to learn more, she spent hours poring over the journal, piecing together fragments of Lila's story. It seemed the voices had tormented Lila to the brink of madness, and she had ultimately vanished without a trace. That evening, Evelyn approached the well again, armed with a flashlight and the kind of reckless determination born of sleepless nights. As she peered into its depths, the beam of her light caught something, an object glinting faintly far below. She felt an overwhelming urge to retrieve it, though the rational part of her mind screamed that it was a terrible idea. Suddenly, the whispers erupted around her, louder than ever, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and anger. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching her ears, and fled to the safety of the house. But the voices followed her, pressing against her like an unseen force. She barricaded herself in her bedroom and sank to the floor, clutching the journal as though it were a lifeline. Through the deafening noise, one voice rose above the rest, clear and commanding, "Find the truth, or we will never leave." The next morning, Evelyn sat in the kitchen with the journal splayed open in front of her, the sunlight streaming through the grimy windows providing little comfort. She hadn't slept. The whispers had quieted sometime before dawn, but their words lingered in her mind like ink stains on paper. "Find the truth," they had said. But how? And at what cost? Determined to understand, Evelyn drove into town for the first time since arriving. It was a quiet, almost lifeless place, with one main street lined by a gas station, a diner, and a crumbling library. She headed straight for the latter, hoping to find records or any mention of the Mercer family. The librarian, a frail woman with piercing blue eyes, seemed startled when Evelyn mentioned the farmhouse. "You're staying out there?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Yes," Evelyn replied cautiously. "Do you know anything about it?" The librarian hesitated before gesturing for Evelyn to follow her to the back of the library, where dusty boxes of old town records were stacked haphazardly. "The Mercer house has always been strange," she said quietly. "People say it's cursed. Lila Mercer disappeared, and her husband, well, they say he went mad before he—" She trailed off, her eyes darting to the ground. "Before he what?" Evelyn pressed. "Before he killed himself," the librarian whispered. "Right by that old well in the woods. People say he threw something down there, a bundle wrapped in cloth. They never found out what it was." Evelyn felt a chill creep down her spine. She spent hours sifting through the records, piecing together a fragmented history. The Mercers had lived in the house for nearly a century, but their lives were marked by tragedy, disappearances, untimely deaths, and rumors of strange occurrences. Each generation seemed more plagued than the last. One document caught her attention, a faded newspaper clipping dated 1928. It detailed the mysterious death of a girl named Clara, who had gone missing and was later found lifeless near the well. Her cause of death was inconclusive, but whispers of foul play had circulated for years. By the time Evelyn returned home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. She stood at the edge of the forest, staring at the well in the distance. Her chest tightened as the whispers began again, faint but insistent. They seemed to be urging her forward, pulling her toward the place she had come to dread. With the journal tucked under her arm and a lantern in hand, Evelyn approached the well once more. The voices grew louder with each step, their tones pleading, angry, and sorrowful all at once. "Show me," she whispered into the darkness. "What do you want me to see?" The ground beneath her seemed to hum as she shone her lantern into the depths. Her light caught the same glint as before, but now it seemed closer, as if the object had risen of its own accord. Summoning all her courage, she tied a rope to a nearby tree and began to lower herself into the well. The descent was slow and nerve-wracking. The stone walls were cold and damp, and the air grew heavier the deeper she went. Finally, her feet touched the muddy bottom. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that made her head throb. She reached out and grasped the object, a rusted tin box, its hinges corroded with time. As she pried it open, she found a bundle of letters and a photograph of a young girl, Clara. The letters were stained and nearly illegible, but one phrase stood out, written in a trembling hand. "Forgive me. I didn't mean for it to happen." The voices ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Evelyn climbed out of the well, clutching the box like a talisman. Back in the house, she spread the contents on the dining table and began to read, piecing together a story of jealousy, betrayal, and a crime long buried. But as the final piece fell into place, she realized the truth was far darker than she could have imagined. The whispers had led her here for a reason, and now that she knew, there was no turning back. Evelyn's hands trembled as she clutched the final letter. The words were faint, smeared by time and tears, but their meaning was undeniable. Lila Mercer had confessed to an unspeakable crime, a desperate act committed in the heat of rage. Clara, the girl in the photograph, wasn't some tragic victim of circumstance. She was Lila's niece, and her life had been snuffed out in a moment of jealousy over an inheritance dispute. Lila had written of her anguish, of how she had thrown Clara's lifeless body into the well to hide her shame. But the act had awakened something in the land, an ancient, restless force that bound itself to the house and all who lived within it. The whispers, the shadows, the strange occurrences, they were echoes of Clara's torment and the curse Lila had unleashed. Evelyn sat back in her chair, her chest heaving. The pieces of the puzzle fit together too perfectly to ignore. She glanced toward the window, where the forest loomed dark and silent. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, as though it were alive and watching. That night, Evelyn couldn't bring herself to sleep. She stayed by the dining table, the tin box and its contents laid out like an offering. As the hours dragged on, the whispers returned, but now they felt different. They weren't angry or accusatory, they were pleading. "What do you want from me?" Evelyn whispered into the darkness. "I've uncovered the truth. Isn't that enough?" The air around her grew colder, and for the first time, she saw them. Figures began to materialize in the shadows, faint, flickering outlines of people. A young girl with wide, sorrowful eyes, a man clutching his head in anguish, a woman whose face was twisted in despair. They were all here, the victims of the house's long and bloody history. Clara stepped forward, her translucent form glowing faintly in the dim light. "You must end it," she said, her voice a gentle echo. "The curse will remain as long as the well stands. Free us, Evelyn." Evelyn's heart ached at the sight of the girl. She nodded, her resolve hardening. She grabbed a can of gasoline from the shed and made her way to the well. The whispers followed her, urging her on, their tone almost reverent. She doused the well and its surroundings, the acrid scent of gasoline burning her nostrils. As she lit a match, the voices swelled into a chorus, their intensity almost unbearable. With a deep breath, she tossed the flame into the pit. The fire roared to life, consuming the well and the surrounding brush. The whispers turned into cries, then laughter, then silence. Evelyn watched as the flames died down, leaving behind only ash and rubble. When she returned to the house, the air felt different, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The figures were gone, and the oppressive atmosphere that had haunted her since her arrival had vanished. Evelyn packed her belongings the next day and left the house behind. She didn't look back as she drove away, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were watching her, grateful and free at last. The house would stand empty for years, its stories fading into local legend. But Evelyn would never forget the whispers or the faces of those who had suffered there. And though she carried their memory with her, she knew she had done what was necessary. The curse was broken, and the voices of the past were finally at rest. The town of Blackwood Hollow was a place forgotten by time, nestled deep in a valley where fog lingered like an uninvited guest. Generations had lived and died there, tethered to its unforgiving soil and the ancient woods that loomed like silent sentinels. No one ever moved to Blackwood Hollow. People only left, if they could. It was here, under the shadow of towering oaks and gnarled pines, that Elise Mortimer found herself. She had come to escape her past, though she wouldn't admit it. Not to herself, and certainly not to the hollow-eyed villagers who watched her arrival like they were awaiting a storm. The house Elise inherited from her estranged aunt was more ruin than refuge, its once proud facade scarred by decades of neglect. As she stood on the sagging porch, suitcase in hand, she couldn't help but shiver. The wind whispered through the cracks in the wooden planks, a sound so faint it almost seemed like voices. Shaking off her unease, she stepped inside, the door groaning in protest. The air smelled of mildew and old wood, and something else, a faint, acrid scent she couldn't quite place. Elise spent the first evening unpacking by candlelight. The electricity had been cut off long before her arrival, and she wasn't eager to wander the labyrinthine halls of the old house in search of a fuse box. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the faded wallpaper, patterns of roses and vines, curling into shapes that seemed almost alive. Every so often, a faint creak echoed through the house, as though the building itself were sighing in its sleep. "Just an old house settling," Elise muttered to herself, though her words felt hollow. It wasn't until the second night that the whispers began in earnest. At first, Elise thought it was the wind again, sneaking through the gaps in the old windows. But as she lay in the moth-eaten bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized the sound was too deliberate. It wasn't just wind, it was voices, hushed and insistent, as though someone were standing just outside her room. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice wavering. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Elise forced herself to get out of bed and check the hallway, clutching the candlestick like a weapon. But there was no one there, only shadows. By the time morning came, Elise had convinced herself she was imagining things. "It's just the stress," she told herself over a cup of bitter coffee. "Moving here, the house, everything, it's messing with my head." But the rationalization didn't last long. That afternoon, as she explored the overgrown garden, she heard the whispers again, this time faint but unmistakable, coming from the edge of the woods. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she called, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the whispers came again, a rush of disjointed words she couldn't quite make out. And yet, there was something undeniably familiar about them, as though they were calling her by name. Elise spent the next several days trying to settle into the house, but unease hung over her like a storm cloud. She avoided the woods, though her curiosity tugged at her with an almost magnetic force. Instead, she busied herself with cleaning and organizing the house, unearthing relics of her aunt's life. Among the stacks of yellowed letters and dusty books, she found an old journal bound in cracked leather. The name, Margaret Mortimer, was scrawled across the cover in faded ink. She flipped through the pages, expecting mundane entries about gardening or weather. But as the journal progressed, the tone shifted. Margaret wrote about the voices and the feeling of being watched. One passage stood out, chilling Elise to the core. "The whispers grow louder at night. They call my name now. I've barred the doors and windows, but it doesn't matter. They are already inside." Elise slammed the journal shut, her heart racing. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps her aunt had been ill, slipping into paranoia in her final days. But deep down, she felt a cold, sinking certainty. Margaret hadn't imagined it. That night, Elise lay awake, every creak of the house amplified in the oppressive silence. Around midnight, the whispers returned. They seemed closer now, almost as if they were coming from within the walls. This time, she could make out fragments of words. "Elise," one voice murmured, faint and breathy. "Come. Home." She sat bolt upright in bed, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Who are you?" she shouted, her voice echoing in the darkness. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. For a moment she thought they were gone. But then, from the far corner of the room, a low, guttural laugh emerged, a sound so unnatural it made her skin crawl. Unable to stay in the room any longer, Elise grabbed her flashlight and bolted downstairs. She needed to get out of the house, if only for a moment, to clear her head. The garden seemed safer in comparison, even with the woods looming nearby. She stood in the moonlight, her breath visible in the chilly air, trying to steady her nerves. The laughter hadn't followed her outside, but something else did. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement at the tree line. She whipped the flashlight toward it, the beam cutting through the darkness. At first, there was nothing but tangled branches and undergrowth. Then, she saw it. A pale figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees, its features obscured by shadow. "Who's there?" Elise demanded, her voice shaking. The figure didn't move or respond. It simply stood there, watching. The flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. The next morning, Elise decided to visit the village library, hoping to find some answers about the house and the land it sat on. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harker, seemed hesitant when Elise mentioned her aunt's name. "The Mortimer house," Mrs. Harker said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's a lot of history there, none of it good." Elise pressed her for details, but Mrs. Harker would only shake her head. "Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep," she said cryptically. Still, she handed Elise a book titled Legends of Blackwood Hollow. Flipping through the pages, Elise found an entire chapter on her family. The Mortimers, it seemed, had a long-standing reputation in the town, one tied to whispers of witchcraft and mysterious disappearances. One passage caught her attention. The woods surrounding the Mortimer estate are said to be cursed. Locals claim to hear voices at night calling them by name. Those who follow the whispers often vanish without a trace. Elise's blood ran cold. She closed the book and thanked Mrs. Harker, her mind racing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in her head, and she was certain now. The voices weren't trying to scare her away. They were trying to lure her in. Elise spent the rest of the afternoon poring over legends of Blackwood Hollow. Each page only deepened her dread. The book described strange rituals performed in the woods by her ancestors, whispers of a pact made long ago. But it was the final entry in the chapter that froze her. The Mortimer curse is said to linger in the bloodline, binding its heirs to the hollow and the voices within. Few have escaped its reach. The words stayed with her as she walked back to the house, the sun dipping below the horizon. Shadows stretched long and thin, swallowing the garden in twilight. The woods seemed to hum with energy, the trees swaying in a wind she couldn't feel. As she stepped onto the porch, she noticed something she hadn't before. Faint scratch marks on the wooden frame of the front door, like claw marks. Her stomach twisted. Inside, the whispers began almost immediately. This time, they didn't wait for nightfall. Elise froze in the middle of the living room as a voice hissed her name, clear and insistent, from somewhere upstairs. Her grip tightened on the journal she had brought with her from the library. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. For a moment, silence answered her. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "The woods." Every instinct told her to run, to pack her things and leave Blackwood Hollow forever. But something deeper, the same gnawing curiosity that had brought her here, kept her rooted. If she didn't confront this now, it would haunt her wherever she went. Steeling herself, Elise grabbed her flashlight and a rusted lantern she found in the kitchen. The woods called, and she couldn't ignore them any longer. The air was colder in the forest, and the light from the lantern barely penetrated the thick canopy. The whispers grew louder as she ventured deeper, threading through the trees like an unseen current. They weren't just in her ears anymore. They were inside her head, wrapping around her thoughts like tendrils. "Elise," one voice murmured. "Closer." "Why are you doing this?" she shouted into the void. The forest absorbed her voice, and the only answer was a sudden rush of wind that extinguished her lantern. She fumbled with her flashlight, its beam flickering weakly before steadying. That's when she saw it, a clearing up ahead, illuminated by the pale light of the full moon. The clearing was unnaturally quiet, the whispers falling away as she stepped into it. At its center stood a twisted, ancient tree, its bark blackened and scarred. Strange symbols were etched into the trunk, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Beneath the tree, half buried in the earth, was a circular stone altar. Elise's pulse quickened as she approached the altar. She could feel the energy radiating from it, a sickly, oppressive force that made her skin crawl. As she reached out to touch the stone, the whispers returned, louder and more frenzied than ever. "Stop," a voice cried, distinct from the others. It was a woman's voice, strong and desperate. Elise spun around, but there was no one there. "Who are you?" Elise asked, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. The woman's voice spoke again, clearer this time. "They want you to free them. Don't listen." Before Elise could respond, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the symbols on the tree flared brightly, casting the clearing in an eerie green light. A shadowy figure emerged from the base of the tree, its form shifting and unnatural, like smoke given life. "Blood calls to blood," the figure intoned, its voice a guttural roar. "You belong to us." Elise stumbled backward, the flashlight falling from her hands. "I don't belong to anyone," she screamed, her voice raw with fear. The figure surged toward her, and for a moment she thought it would consume her. But then the woman's voice returned, sharp and commanding. "Run, Elise. Get out of the woods." Elise didn't need to be told twice. She turned and bolted, branches clawing at her as she ran. The whispers pursued her, growing louder and more frantic, but she didn't look back. When she finally burst through the tree line and into her garden, the house loomed ahead like a sanctuary. Collapsing onto the porch, Elise gasped for air, her entire body trembling. The whispers had stopped, but she knew the danger was far from over. She could feel it now, like a weight pressing down on her. The curse was real, and it was tightening its grip. Elise sat on the porch until the first light of dawn painted the horizon. Her mind reeled with questions and terror, but one thing was certain: she couldn't run from this. The voices, the shadows, the curse, they would follow her wherever she went. The strange woman's voice in the woods had saved her, but Elise didn't know who she was or why she was helping. There was only one option left: to confront the truth. As soon as the morning sun broke through the mist, Elise returned to the house. She grabbed Margaret's journal and flipped to the final entries. Her aunt had written about the clearing, the altar, and the tree. One passage stood out. "I tried to break the connection, but the bloodline is the key. Only one of us can undo the pact. The whispers will never stop until they are free, or until they take me." Elise's breath caught in her throat. Her aunt had known about the curse and had tried to stop it. But what had she meant by "the bloodline is the key"? The answer lay in the house. Elise was certain of it. She spent hours searching every room, every crevice, until she found it. A small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the study. Inside was a collection of items that made her stomach churn. A lock of hair tied with red thread, a dagger with strange symbols etched into the blade, and a folded piece of parchment. Unfolding it, Elise saw it was a crude map of the woods, marked with the same clearing she had stumbled into the night before. Beneath the map, in her aunt's handwriting, were the words, "The altar must be destroyed." Elise stared at the dagger, her hands trembling. The whispers had been quiet all morning, but now they returned, low and urgent. "Elise," they murmured, "don't fight it." She clenched her jaw, steeling herself. She didn't fully understand what she was facing, but she couldn't ignore the instructions. If her aunt believed the altar could be destroyed, then she had to try. As the sun dipped below the horizon once again, Elise armed herself with the dagger and the map, setting out for the woods. The forest seemed alive as she moved deeper into it, the trees groaning and swaying despite the still air. The whispers followed her every step, growing louder the closer she got to the clearing. When she finally arrived, the scene was even more sinister than she remembered. The tree loomed like a gnarled sentinel, the symbols on its bark glowing faintly in the darkness. Elise approached the altar, gripping the dagger tightly. The whispers surged, a cacophony of voices overlapping, pleading, threatening, begging. "Don't," one voice cried. "You'll doom us all," another hissed. But over them all, the woman's voice cut through like a blade. "Do it, Elise. End this." Raising the dagger, Elise hesitated. The shadows beneath the tree seemed to shift, forming faces twisted in agony and rage. One of them spoke, its voice thick with malice. "You don't understand what you're doing. Without us, you will have nothing. No power, no family, no escape." Tears streamed down Elise's face as she drove the dagger into the stone altar. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, and the voices erupted into a deafening scream. The symbols on the tree flared brightly, then faded, leaving the bark blackened and lifeless. The shadows writhed, shrinking and dissipating into the night. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the ground beneath the altar cracked, and the stones split apart, releasing a surge of dark energy that nearly knocked Elise off her feet. The woman's voice returned, softer now. "It's done. They're gone. You're free." Elise sank to her knees, the dagger slipping from her grasp. The clearing felt different now, empty, but not hostile. The oppressive weight she had felt since arriving in Blackwood Hollow was gone. She stared at the ruined altar, her chest heaving. Had she truly broken the curse, or had she unleashed something even worse? Back at the house, Elise found the whispers were gone. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive gloom that had hung over the estate seemed to lift. But as she stood in the doorway, staring out at the now quiet woods, a single question lingered in her mind. What had her family truly done to bind themselves to this place? The journal provided no answers, and Elise wasn't sure she wanted to dig any deeper. For now, she was content to let the past remain buried, just like the shadows beneath the tree. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom that night, she paused at the top step, listening. There was no sound, no whispers, no laughter, only silence. But deep in the woods where the altar had been destroyed, the ground shifted. And somewhere, far beneath the surface, something stirred.